sunset meets storytelling in the open air. They will walk
Hadirin yang kami hormati, sesaat lagi acara akan segera kita mulai. Kami persilahkan untuk menempati kursi yang tadi disediakan. Mungkin teman-teman bisa maju di bagian depan, silakan. Bapak Ibu silakan bisa maju di memenuhi kursi di bagian depan. Selamat datang kepada Menteri Kebudayaan Bapak Fadlizon beserta rombongan. Kami persilakan untuk menempati tempat yang telah disediakan.
If I can sit on this side here because my right ear works. Mr. Minister, my hearing is poor and my right ear works better. Okay. So if you don't mind. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning. Before we start, I would like to extend gratitude to Excellency Dr. Fadlizon, Minister of Culture, Dr. Vice Minister of Culture, Bapak Giring, Dr. John Lenskowski, Founder, President Emeritus, and Chancellor of the Institute of World Politics, who is our distinguished speaker in today's session. And everyone, thank you for showing up this morning. And also for those who are following us in YouTube, thank you. And first, Dr. Estonski, once again, thank you very much for complying with our invitation. This, in spite of the short notice, we truly appreciate your time for this session amid your tight schedule here in Jakarta, Indonesia. So this morning we are joined by our colleagues from Ministry of Culture and also researchers, students from several universities in Jakarta. And we are all eager to listen to your presentation and later to take part in the discussion. This public lecture is part of our journey to at least 3 international events, conferences in Indonesia. First is the summit on Candi, or Culture, Heritage, Art, Narrative, Diplomacy and Innovation. In short, we call it Candi, which happens also means temple in Bahasa Indonesia. It will be held in early September this year. And the second event is the Synergy of the Pacific. This is a cultural cooperation initiative by the Minister of Culture, Pak Fadlizon, with the Pacific Island nations, including Fiji, Samoa, PNG, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and some others. It will be held in November in East Nusa Tenggara, and it aims to strengthen cultural networks, promoting dialogue and appreciation, strengthening the inclusive regional diplomacy, and also empowering local communities. And the third one is the first Indonesia International Conference on Cultural Diplomacy. It is jointly hosted by the Minister of Culture with the Faculty of Social and Political Science of the University of Indonesia. It will be held in November, and the conference targets academics, policymakers, cultural practitioners, and the general public. So if you can come again in November, it will be very, we are very delightful, John. And other than that, of course, a lot of things, programs are currently taking place by the ministry, not only in Jakarta, but throughout Indonesia. Not only festivals, but also works like preservation, nurturing the art and performing arts ecosystem, promoting literature, and also the works like repatriation of cultural heritage from other countries. And so distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before I invite Pak John to speak, I would like to invite Ministry of Culture, Dr. Fadlizon, for his opening remarks, where he wants to elaborate about culture in Indonesia or more, maybe about the work of our ministry. So Pak Menteri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Dirjen, Ibu Enda. So maybe, first of all, I would like to read this pantun in English. A bird of paradise perches high, its colors shine, enchanting the sight. We uphold our cultural ties for unity and peace to shine bright. So it's, I think, the right rhyme also. So Honorable Dr. John Langzowski, Founder, President Emeritus, and Rector of the Institute of World Politics, welcome to our Minister of Culture. We have Vice Minister of Culture, Bapak Giring Ganesa. He's a prominent singer actually. Yeah. Ibu Dirjen, Ibu Enda Swastuti, the Director General for Cultural Diplomacy, Promotion and Cooperation. And we have also some directors from our ministry, and of course, distinguished invited students from various campuses in Greater Jakarta, and all esteemed guests. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, shalom, om swastiastu, nama budaya, salam kebajikan, rahayu, and good morning. So all praise to God Almighty for, by His grace, we can gather here today in this joyful morning at the public lecture theme, Harmony Beyond Borders, Unlocking the Potential of Cultural Diplomacy. It is a great honor for us to welcome Dr. John Langzowski to Jakarta. Your presence today is tangible proof of your commitment to the importance of global diplomacy. With your background, you have directly witnessed how the power of culture can be used as an instrument or vehicle to influence foreign policy and build relations between nations. This insight is something we truly need. We all realize that in today's rapidly changing global landscape, culture is no longer just the subject of diplomacy. but also the method, the medium, and even the message itself. So cultural diplomacy has become a main pillar of international relations. It is a meeting ground that facilitates dialogue, promotes cultural uniqueness, and encourages cross-border interaction. As Indonesians, we bring the richness of historical experience and cultural depth to this global conversation. As one of the world's mega diverse countries, the diversity we possess, both cultural and biological, is a source of our diplomatic strength. We do not merely present one culture, but thousands of treasures from Sabang to Merauke, from Yangas to Rote, from oral traditions, languages, and arts, including dance, music, theater, to local knowledge and wisdom, culinary heritage, and diverse philosophies of life. All these are our assets for building friendship and understanding at the global level. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and the students I'm proud of, there are several important points we must all note. First, cultural diplomacy is not limited to government initiatives. On the contrary, it encompasses a wide range of approaches, from the repatriation of cultural objects as a form of restorative justice to the role of everyday aesthetic such as food and textiles in fostering intercultural understanding. Second, we must recognize the vital role of all stakeholders in cultural diplomacy, which is why I invite everyone here not to view cultural diplomacy as the sole responsibility of the ministry, but as a collective movement. Let us build an ecosystem in which each party has a unique role and contribution, maintaining dialogue when official channels are under strain. And third, we must strive to produce practical outputs in cultural diplomacy. The insights we will gain from Dr. Langzowski today will serve as one of the foundations for formulating these policy briefs, which will become a blueprint for the government in developing and implementing a more structured and effective Indonesian cultural diplomacy strategy. I hope that through this valuable session, we can all gain a deeper understanding of the potential of cultural diplomacy as an instrument of peace and sustainable development. May our discussion today inspire and broaden our perspectives while also strengthening our commitment to making cultural diplomacy an integral part of Indonesia's foreign policy and international engagement. So in closing, I wish you all an insightful and fruitful public lecture, and may we make the best use of this golden opportunity. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Dr. Lesonsky, before you start, just a short introduction to our ministry. So it has 3 Director General. First is Director General for Protection and Traditions. The second is a Director General for Management and Utilization. And the third one is Director General for Diplomacy, Promotion and Cooperation, which I have the honor to lead. And from your recent lectures in Nahdlatul Ulama, in Lemhanas, and later today in Kemhan, I will sure that you will see that some of your ideas is related to our my directorate. So we are eager to hear from you about the potential of Indonesia's cultural diplomacy to reach its best for the economy, for the industry, for sustainable and better future. So without further ado, I would like to invite Pak John to have the floor. This one.
Is this is working here? It is.
Sure, you can work.
Yeah, I'm going to use this. Then I don't have to bend down. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Salam alaikum. I am honored to join you this morning. I'm amazed and I am grateful to see how so many of you have taken time away from your desks to come and listen to this. So thank you very much for your warm welcome, Edna, and thank you so much, Mr. Minister, for hosting me. This is an amazing honor for me to come here, and I would like to thank many people who are responsible for my first visit to Indonesia and, of course, to Jakarta. Especially, I would like to express my gratitude to Pak Yahya Stakuf of the Nadlatul Ulama, Holland Taylor, who works very closely with him, with the Lib for All Foundation, and Dr. Timothy Shah, who is my colleague, who is strategic director for the Center for Shared Civilizational Values, is also a scholar at the University of Dallas in Texas. So I would like today to offer a few reflections on the subject of cultural diplomacy. And I think it's important when studying this field to pay attention to what its definition is. What is cultural diplomacy? There is a conventional definition which says that cultural diplomacy produces mutual understanding, it facilitates relations between nations and between peoples. It can also generate appreciation for one's own country by promoting art, information, ideas, science, sports, and so many other things. But cultural diplomacy has also been used to compete in global political competition, particularly to compete with the cultural diplomacy campaigns of adversary countries, which try to prove their superiority as a culture to your own. And so cultural diplomacy in different periods of history has been an instrument of Cold War. And during the Cold War between the United States and the West on the one hand, and the Soviet Union and communism on the other hand, cultural diplomacy was used to influence foreign audiences, to have a positive impression of the United States. It was designed to change the policies of foreign governments. It was designed, of course, to prevent conflicts and to promote political change in foreign lands. It was designed to improve our understanding of foreign cultures and to improve our intelligence capabilities, and therefore to understand the intentions and the purposes of foreign powers. In other words, cultural diplomacy also has to be designed for national security and the advancement of other interests, including commercial interests. And that means that cultural diplomacy is actually a subsidiary, a subset of public diplomacy, which means relations with people and influence over people, and not just governments, influence over people and opinion leaders, cultural figures, and so on. So it's important to stress this point because some cultural diplomats subordinate cultural diplomacy to the needs of traditional diplomacy. But as a public diplomacy function, cultural diplomacy is dealing with a separate branch of policy. Traditional diplomats are worried about relations with governments. This is the principal focus of foreign ministries all over the world. And oftentimes those foreign ministries think that public diplomacy, including cultural diplomacy, is simply a support function for their efforts to work on relations with other governments. The problem is that public diplomacy and traditional government-to-government diplomacy can be completely separate things. And you can understand this when you look at relations with a hostile, aggressive adversary. On a government-to-government basis, your government may want to have, let's say, cool relations, correct relations, sometimes confrontational relations with that government. But you always want to have warm relations with the people. And the people should never be your adversary. And so there's a distinction here because traditional government-to-government diplomacy and public diplomacy require two separate policies. Now, as a public diplomacy function, cultural diplomacy should integrate other functions of foreign policy, such as information policy, countering hostile propaganda, ideological competition, religious diplomacy, and building relationships of trust with other people, which are essential for harmonious business relationships, diplomacy, and even intelligence. Now, cultural diplomacy can also be integrated with political warfare and subversion and psychological strategy. And many people in the foreign policy community of foreign ministries all around the world, and I don't know enough about the Indonesian foreign ministry, but I suspect it's similar to that of other foreign ministries, that foreign ministries do not pay particular attention to political warfare. Political warfare is a priority for aggressive, revisionist, revolutionary states who try to change the global strategic environment, who may encroach upon their neighbors, who may attempt to exercise hegemony over their neighbors, and who may even want to extend their influence on a global basis. I teach my students that there are two different types of animals in the forest. There are carnivores and there are herbivores. And the carnivores eat the herbivores, and the herbivores eat grass and leaves. They do not eat the carnivores. And the cleverest of the carnivores try to persuade the herbivores that they are herbivores too.
And one of the great challenges in international relations is to see foreign reality correctly. And so many people don't want to see it correctly. Many people engage in mirror imaging, where you look at other people as if they are just like you and have the same benevolent attitudes as you do. And then there are those whose perception of reality is distorted by propaganda, disinformation, and strategic deception. And there are some powers that are masters at strategic deception. But in the United States, for example, the study of deception is not a professional discipline in the American intelligence community. We don't like to think about deception, and one of the reasons is we think that we're so smart. We think we're so smart that we cannot be deceived. And of course, when you have such an arrogant attitude, when you're so overconfident, you are the ripe target for deception. Then some people want to be deceived. There's the whole moral problem where people engage in wishful thinking, willful blindness, or the phenomenon called the desire not to know. Because if you know the truth about an aggressive adversary and his human rights violations and his subversion and his deception and his cheating on treaties and his intellectual property theft and all sorts of other crimes that are committed in the real world by certain types of regimes, the carnivores of this world, then maybe if you know about these things, you might have to do something about it. You may have a moral or a strategic obligation to try to protect your people and protect your allies from the depredations of those carnivores in the forest. But many people don't want to see reality. They wish it away because they hope it'll go away. But it doesn't go away. And of course, this is not an intellectual problem, ladies and gentlemen. It is a moral problem. It is a moral failing. And one cannot conduct a coherent and effective foreign policy and national security policy unless you have moral strategic clarity. And moral strategic clarity derives from something. It derives from an overall moral understanding of life. Are there standards of good and evil in the world? Objective standards. So many people in the West, and amongst very prosperous people in the East and in the global South, don't believe there are objective moral standards. They want their morality to be what they prefer it to be. Their morality is their own choice, their own personal preferences. And if they want to violate the bonds of their marriage, oh, that's okay. If they want to cheat somebody in business, oh, that's okay. If they want to steal, that's okay. Just, whoever gets the most number of toys when they die wins the game, right? So there are people like that. You know that. The big struggle in the world, which I'll get to a little bit more, is a struggle between those who believe that there are objective standards of right and wrong that apply to all people at all times and all places, versus those who don't believe that. And the question is, which camp are you in? And are you going to have sufficient understanding of moral categories to translate that into moral strategic clarity so that you see reality of the world as it is rather than the way you wish it to be or the way some ideology persuades you or the way some propaganda persuades you or the way some bribery from a foreign power corrupts you into believing. So, cultural diplomacy, as I said, can be worked into and integrated with such things as political warfare. What is political warfare? Well, it involves such things as discrediting your adversary. It means exploiting divisions within his ranks. It means separating him from his population support base. It means separating him from his recruitment base. It means separating him from his allies. These are all techniques of political warfare. They are going on in the world all around us all the time. Do we choose to pay attention to this or not? Or do we want to pretend that it is not happening? Cultural diplomacy can be conducted without association with politics. That's what's amazing about it. And without any strings attached. It can be conducted both by governmental forces and by non-governmental forces. And it can be conducted by these people without even them being aware of its potential integration with the other arts of statecraft. So how does cultural diplomacy work? Well, cultural diplomacy uses techniques like exposing people to the arts, exhibitions, exchanges. It uses educational programs, literature, language teaching, broadcasting, gift giving, listening to others, and promoting ideas. And by doing these things, it tends to make foreign audiences break down the barriers that they erect in order to prevent themselves from listening to people whom they do not trust. We all erect these barriers. You know that such and such an individual is corrupt, is dishonest. Well, you're not particularly going to listen to him. You know that such and such a political party is toxic and corrupt and maybe even murderous. So you're not going to listen to them. But cultural diplomacy can help break down that barrier. And sometimes that barrier is there unfairly. Sometimes they think that you're a really bad person when in fact you're not. And so if you use cultural diplomacy, you're able to encourage them to listen to you a little bit, to be more curious about you. Cultural diplomacy can melt their heart so that they can, they might be willing to negotiate with you. It's a door opener. And you want to put it another way, it is a sophisticated form of psychological conditioning in order to make people more amenable to working with you, listening to you, negotiating with you, etc. Now, One of the most interesting things about cultural diplomacy is that when it is intelligently conceived, you share with your foreign audience beauty, beautiful paintings, beautiful dance, beautiful music, all sorts of different art forms. Some, of course, we know this power of cultural influence in the world. And American and a lot of Western pop culture today is actually, in my opinion, very harmful. You know that there is music that is ennobling. And there's also music that is degrading. There is art that is beautiful, and there's art that is ugly. There is literature that will teach you the great lessons of life, and there is literature that will debauch you, that will harm you morally, that will erode your ability to be a good person, to completely impede your ability to achieve holiness in your life and to treat others with compassion. And literature and movies and all sorts of different cultural products can do those things. And unfortunately, the marketplace encourages the sale and the consumption of many toxic cultural products. And so if they happen to come from your country, and I don't think too many of them come from Indonesia, a lot of them come from America, then our cultural diplomacy in America has to do something to show that there's something better in our country. We have more symphony orchestras in America than probably the rest of the world combined. I'm not sure about that statistic, but we have an awful lot of symphony orchestras, and they play beautiful music, not degrading music. We have lots of artists. My wife, whom I lost just a few months ago after 42 years of marriage, she was a watercolor artist, and I was participating in the art shows with her, and she was teaching an art class, and I got to know this world reasonably well. And it's a wonderful world, and there's a lot of beautiful art that's being created in America that's different from some of the ugly art that sells in New York City for very high prices. So, beauty. Beauty is the ancient philosophers told us that beauty is related to goodness and truth. And you may not have to study Aristotle deeply in order to understand this. You can understand this almost in your heart, viscerally, that there's a relationship between beauty, truth, and goodness. And I'll tell you one of my favorite stories about cultural diplomacy. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union invested more money and effort in anti-American, anti-Western propaganda in India than anywhere else in the world. Why? In order to separate the world's largest democracy from the world's oldest democracy. And both powers, India and America, had a common British colonial heritage. So there were some commonalities between our two countries that should have been realized in more harmonious relations between the two of us. But the Soviet propaganda was so effective that the most anti-American people I ever met in my life from outside of the country, because there are plenty of anti-American people inside America too. But the most anti-American people from outside the country came from India. So one day, our public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy agency at the time, the United States Information Agency, sent a college choir to New Delhi to give a concert. I think it was the choir from Princeton University. And they sang beautiful songs. And it had a dramatic effect on that audience. Now, what is the image of the United States in many minds of Indian people? Well, India, remember, is perhaps the most religious country in the world. And so they saw, and then you combine that with the Soviet propaganda, and the image is that the Americans are secular, materialistic, rapacious, exploitative capitalists, and aggressive imperialists. And this is not a particularly good combination, is it? So here, they hear beauty from the Princeton choir. Beauty. And it had the impact, the political, cultural impact of a tactical nuclear weapon. The great philosopher, theologian of the early 20th century, G.K. Chesterton, was speculating about the theory of evolution. And he said, let's look at the life of the caveman. What do we know about the caveman? We don't really know if he lived in the cave. But we do know one thing about him. He was very good at art. He could paint very nice paintings on the wall of the cave. And then Chesterton says, the point here is that it's not that the caveman does art well and the chimpanzee does it poorly. The point is that the chimpanzee does not do art at all. And what that means is, if human beings evolved from the great apes, from the chimpanzees and the others, something more than evolution happened. Chesterton said art is a reflection of the soul. And what happened, if there was an evolution from the great apes to the human being, something revolutionary happened, and his explanation is that God put the soul into the human being that is not there in the great apes. Which means that art is a reflection of the soul. It is a reflection of the spiritual dimension of human life. And so the Indian audience didn't need my lecture to tell them this. They could feel it instinctively, that these young people who were giving them beauty represented an aesthetic sensibility in the hearts and the souls of Americans. And that maybe not all Americans were a bunch of secular, materialist, rapacious exploiters and aggressive imperialists. And that maybe there's some people who are concerned with beauty and truth and goodness. And maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to what some of the Americans have to say. This is how cultural diplomacy works. And so, cultural diplomacy is particularly relevant to Indonesia and explains a lot about why I made my first trip in my life to Indonesia and to anywhere in East Asia. I've traveled in many places in the world, to the Middle East, to Europe, to the Soviet Union, and so on, but never here. Why did I think it was important, strategically important, to come here? It's because Indonesia is one of the most important countries in the world, but you don't think so yet. But it is. You're not only the largest Islamic country in the world, but you're one of the largest democracies in the world. And when you look at what is going on in the world today, there are two great epic struggles. One of them is the 100-year-old war of totalitarian ideologies against Western civilization, Western democracy, and what we at IWP, my graduate school, call decent civilization wherever else in the world it can be found. And Indonesia is in that camp of decent civilization. Indonesia has freedom and democracy that does not exist in many parts of the world. Indonesia has resisted totalitarian movements. And what is this 100-year totalitarian war? It's the war of the different totalitarian ideologies, each of which are tempted by totalitarian methods and the secular thirst for power and domination. And that is communism, fascism, Nazism, and radical Islamist jihadism. I happen to think that a huge portion, maybe not all, of the radical Islamist jihadists are not motivated by a desire for holiness. They are not motivated by a desire to achieve a greater spiritual dimension of their lives. They're motivated by secular political passion. Well, I have known about the Nahdlatul Ulama for at least 20 years. And I learned about the incredible work and the spiritual guidance of Gus Mus and Gus Dur and now Gus Yahya. I learned about the book, The Illusion of an Islamic State by Gus Dur, where he says, you, dear reader, if you think that you're going to create an Islamic state as a secular political entity, you are living an illusion. You will achieve the Islamic state when you, dear reader, have achieved holiness. There's a powerful truth to this. And it is, and what the Nahdlatul Ulama has done with the, and I'll tell you, I'm an expert on communism. I'm an expert on the different, I was an expert on US-Soviet relations. I was Ronald Reagan's advisor in the White House on Soviet affairs for 4 years. I've been paying attention to totalitarian ideologies for a long time. I have visited with my father. My father was one of the pioneering scholars of the Middle East in the world, teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. He wrote many books. He traveled to the Middle East every year for 35 to 40 years. He brought me with him And I remember visiting the Middle East when the Arab world was actually loved the United States. This was in the early 1960s, before the 1967 war, which I believe changed a lot of things, the war between the Arabs and the Israelis. But it was not a necessary, for years, there was never a necessary clash between America and the Arab world, or even the Islamic world at large. We have significant Muslim populations that have come to America and live very harmoniously in our country. Interreligious harmony is possible. In the land of my ancestors, which is Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for hundreds of years, had a nobility, a class of landed nobility. And they were, and who were they? Were they all just Poles? No. It was multi-confessional, multi-religious. There were Catholics, there were Protestants, there were Jews, and there were Muslims. The Muslims were mostly Tartars, and they were admitted into the nobility in Poland. And they considered themselves, and still do consider themselves, Polish patriots. Interreligious harmony is possible. And if we want to live in peace in the world, and if you think cultural diplomacy is designed to try to achieve peace, which is one of its sure objectives, then we need to be working for interreligious harmony. And when I see what the Nahdlatul Ulama has done now, it has created a center for shared civilizational values, which Dr. Shah is the strategic director of this organization. It has created the Institute of Humanitarian Islam. It is dedicated to working on ensuring that Islam is not a source of problems and of perennial conflict in this world, but is a source of solutions and of peace and of harmony. And that if Islam is going to win adherents, it will do so because of its inherent goodness, not because of its coercion. Anyway, the fact that the Nahdlatul Ulama today wants to expand its influence in the world in a way that is commensurate with its immense size. It's 115 million members in the world today. This is of global strategic importance. Now, the war against totalitarianism is not only going on against the totalitarian varieties of Islam, it's going on against communist China. And communist China may be the greatest threat of all of them, because it has now been subordinating all of its efforts to creating an Orwellian surveillance state internally and engaging in relentless gray zone aggression abroad. Propaganda, deception, intellectual property theft. In the United States, in Silicon Valley, one of our alumni, who is a counterintelligence officer, the most highly decorated intelligence officer in any of the intelligence agencies under the umbrella of the Pentagon, tells us that there are 25,000 Chinese intelligence collectors in Silicon Valley alone. And they are stealing our intellectual property, and they're applying it to their military machine. And America is only beginning to wake up to the strategic threat that is being posed by China. China is attempting to influence Indonesia and our own country in innumerable different ways. They have corrupted our media. The New York Times and the Washington Post have taken millions of dollars from Beijing to publish Chinese communist propaganda. And you cannot read the truth about strategic developments in China that are inimical to the national security of the United States and our friends. The major universities and the major think tanks have been taking money from the Chinese and doing joint projects with them. Hollywood has been heavily controlled by the Chinese. Former secretaries of state and secretaries of defense are directly or indirectly on Beijing's payroll. They finish their public service, they go work for a consulting firm that opens doors in Beijing for American corporations. The American corporation gets a monopoly contract, very comfortable for them, and then they pay the former elder statesman. And the result is that those elder statesmen never say anything about the threat from Communist China. I call it Communist China rather than just China because it's an illegitimate regime that rules without the consent of the governed. The Chinese nation and the Chinese people are not represented by the Communist Party. And I believe that having harmonious relations with the Chinese people is an essential part of our public diplomacy and our cultural diplomacy. In any event, there are many more things that I can say about this larger war of totalitarianism. But I just hope that, I believe there's one basic principle in international affairs, and that is to see the truth and to tell the truth. See the truth and tell the truth, and even when the reality is painful to look at. And you all, as cultural diplomats, have a very grave responsibility in living by the truth and doing so in a way that can help build better relations with peoples around the world and champion the superiority of free societies that live by the consent of the governed, by the rule of law, and ultimately by subordination to the higher law that governs us all. The natural law, the law written on the human heart that is put there by God. And if we don't listen to that natural law, if we don't listen to the little voice of conscience, our lives will simply not be fruitful, and the world will become a more dangerous and oppressive place. So you all have a very grave and critical and strategic responsibility, and I wish you God's blessings in the success in your mission. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, John. I think I can listen to your presentation for hours, and if I'm younger, I can take your classes back in DC. So can we have a big round of applause again for John? So, and we will have like 15 minutes or 30 minutes for questions and answer. If you have some question for Pak John, later. But before, tunggu sabar ya, before Pak Menteri akan ada acara lain, sehingga beliau akan menyerahkan some placard for Pak John as a souvenir that you've been here at the ministry. The minister has to leave for another engagement, but he wants to give you some souvenir before he leaves this room. Silakan. Terima kasih Pak Menteri. Oke, tadi sudah ada yang ingin tanya, mungkin 3 pertanyaan ya. Mungkin dari 1, 2, oh oke dari sana 3, oke. Mungkin yang pertama ada mikrofon.
Hello, tes. Okay. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, thank you so much. Firstly, my name is Christina. I'm from Universitas Indonesia, University of Indonesia, majoring international relations. I'm a student. I love how you unpacking the terminology of cultural diplomation and how it works in the reality. With that, I want to ask, if cultural diplomacy is powerful in building soft power and influencing perceptions, can an unfavorable political or strategic conditions of a country weaken or even override its impact? For example, even if cultural diplomacy is strong, will negative perceptions of a nation's strategic or governance flaws make audience dismiss its cultural outreach as mere propaganda or distractions? If I can make it to a grand question, the question is, can outstanding cultural diplomacy overcome a country's negative political image, or will it always be overshadowed by geopolitical controversies? Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very intelligent question. And forgive me for hesitating, but my hearing is not very good, and so I asked my colleague to try to repeat the question to me. When one speaks quickly with a sound system like this, it's very hard for me to understand. I think that cultural diplomacy can always do some good, even when there is an atmosphere of hostile propaganda. There is such an incredible power to cultural diplomacy that its various techniques do work. However, let me just say this. Sometimes cultural diplomacy can be more effective than others, but that's when there is, in my opinion, a moral, spiritual authenticity underlying it, where there is a moral, spiritual spirit underlying that cultural diplomacy, which is very consciously geared towards promoting the good rather than the culturally decadent. And so this is, and when that is done, when there is a strong moral spiritual component to the cultural diplomacy, then I believe it can break down lots of barriers, and even in the climate of hostile propaganda. The Soviet Union conducted a massive cultural diplomacy campaign. And although there were very intensive periods of anti-communism in the United States, that would wax and wane, it would get more and less intensive. I remember that under Mikhail Gorbachev, there was a huge cultural offensive conducted toward the United States in so many ways. And one of my favorite examples is where the Red Army Chorus came to perform at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. And they sang, of course, their mighty Soviet military songs, but then they sang the U.S. national anthem. And at the end of their concert, they got a standing ovation. People stood up and shouted their applause. Now, this was at the same time that the Soviets were carpet bombing Afghanistan. Now, what is carpet bombing? Carpet bombing is when you drop bombs on all of the agricultural fields so that the people living in the villages can no longer grow their food, and they are forced to flee to the cities, which were controlled by the communists, who could then brainwash their children in the communist-controlled schools. And simultaneously, the Soviets were dropping these little helicopter-like devices that came from actual helicopters. They came sort of like the pods flying for, the seeds coming from trees down to the ground. They're this big, and the children would come over thinking that they were toys, and they would pick one up, and it would blow off their hand and blow off their arm, and they were permanently disfigured for the rest of their lives. And these were weapons that were specifically targeted against children. Why? So that the parents, in order to protect their children, would leave the village and go to the cities where it was safer. So why did the Soviets want to do this? To give absolutely no support in the countryside for the anti-communist Mujahideen resistance who were fighting the Soviet occupation of their country. Now, these are monstrous crimes. And the Soviets were also using chemical weapons in Afghanistan. Another international crime, violation of treaties that they had signed. Oh, but their army comes with their chorus and sings, and the American audience stands and smiles and shouts and applauds. Cultural diplomacy works even under conditions like that. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Dr. John Leskonski. Thank you for the insightful presentation and also welcome to Indonesia. My name is Dea. I'm from University of Indonesia. I really love the presentation about the cultural diplomacy and the security. So I will ask about the security part. So how does a cultural diplomacy respond to the parties that are aggressive or have a long history of hostility? And also, is there a point at which cultural diplomacy is no longer effective and must be balanced with other approaches? Thank you.
Okay. Did you get that?
How does bagaimana diplomasi budaya merespon ketika suatu pihak memiliki pendekatan secara agresif atau mempunyai sejarah yang kelam ketika berhubungan dengan negara lain, dan juga apakah bisa pada suatu poin ketika cultural diplomasi tidak bisa digunakan lagi karena tidak efektif, dan juga apakah cara untuk menyeimbangkan pendekatan tersebut bagaimana? Terima kasih.
Our philosophy at the Institute of World Politics is a philosophy of integrated strategy. And I believe that cultural diplomacy, and when I say integrated strategy, this is what I mean. Each one of the instruments of national power, military, diplomatic, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, political warfare, intelligence, counterintelligence, economic strategy in its many forms, cyber strategy, law enforcement. Each one of these is like an instrument in the orchestra. And you have to play your instrument well, and you have to realize that you are part of an orchestra. And you cannot be blaring your trumpet loudly when it is the time of the symphony to listen to the solo violin. And so, since cultural diplomacy is targeting publics, because it's part of public diplomacy, it is always relevant, no matter what is going on anywhere else. And there could be a war going on, but cultural diplomacy, insofar as it can be exercised, can be and should be exercised, because we want to have warm relations with foreign publics. And so, sometimes in bilateral relations, things can get very bad. Things can get, countries go to war. And just let me, so many people pretend that maybe we can avoid war by choosing the quiet life, by choosing the middle course, by pretending that our adversary did not violate the treaty, by pretending that he didn't commit some kind of a war crime. I mean, President Obama warned Bashar Assad of Syria that if he used chemical weapons against his own people, that there would be terrible consequences. So Assad used chemical weapons against his own people, and Obama did nothing. And of course, his credibility, and the credibility of the United States sank to the lowest level possible because, he didn't want to address reality. He didn't want to face reality. And sometimes when aggression of this type takes place, especially when it takes place against you, then, do you pretend that it hasn't taken place? Do you wish it away? Too many people do that. And unfortunately, that does not produce peace. Peace has to be produced in the case of irreconcilable conflicts, conflicts that simply cannot be solved because they are ideological in nature. Then what peace exists has to be produced by deterrence, and deterrence requires capability. Deterrence requires actually making a threat that if the adversary does some kind of aggressive action, that he will suffer some grave consequences for doing so. And of course, how do you raise children? Do you keep letting them do the bad thing every day and day in and day out? No. You have to discipline them. And if you don't discipline them and you don't have credibility about it, your children will turn first into spoiled brats. Have you ever heard that expression, a spoiled brat? And then they turn into monsters and sociopaths. And that's what happens when you don't raise your children well. Well, take a little lesson from child rearing and apply it to international affairs, and chances are there might be a little less war. So, but cultural diplomacy will always be applicable unless an entire people has turned evil. And sometimes we begin to think that about others. During World War II, there were many Americans who thought that the German people had all become evil and that they needed to be punished. And a lot of Americans thought that the Japanese people had turned evil and that they needed to be punished. And unfortunately, we dropped the atomic bomb on the Japanese, which killed many, many civilians. And even before the bomb, we were doing firebombing of Tokyo, which killed all kinds of civilians, which was wrong. It was wrong. But, we have a tradition in America and in the West of trying to look at our sins, trying to atone for them, and then trying to improve ourselves. And if we admit those sins, and if we tell the truth about these things and are true to ourselves, then maybe we might become better as a nation and more responsible and continue to reach that state of being part of the forces of good in the world rather than compromising our moral character.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jones, for your insightful sessions. Let me introduce myself. My name is Faiza, and I am from Isafis. I have a question that how might cultural diplomacy be restructured to meaningfully include and elevate marginalized voice, such as indigenous peoples, diasporic communities, or stateless nations, whose cultural identities are often excluded from formal diplomatic platforms? Thank you. Indonesia. Oh, ya. Bagaimana diplomasi budaya itu dapat direstrukturisasi agar secara bermakna dapat menyertakan dan mengangkat suara-suara yang terpinggirkan seperti masyarakat adat, komunitas diaspora atau negara-negara tanpa kewarganegaraan yang identitas budayanya sering dikecualikan dari platform diplomatik formal. Terima kasih.
A little bit. Can you repeat it?
Essentially, how can cultural diplomacy incorporate otherwise neglected voices, indigenous people, marginalized places?
This is a very interesting and provocative question, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy to incorporate the role of marginalized people, indigenous people who may be minorities or other minority groups into cultural diplomacy. I think a conscious effort has to be done along these lines to be inclusive in order that there be a proper representation of a nation in its cultural portrayal to the world. I think that we in America have become much more sensitive to this than we used to be. We have, many different minority groups in the United States, many immigrant groups. We have, of course, our indigenous population. I don't know if they are actually indigenous because they may have defeated some people who lived there before they did. Only they didn't record their victories and their territorial conquests in the history books because there were no history books. We do work on trying to show how various minority groups live. We try to share their different artistic forms. In some cases, you've all heard of jazz. What's jazz? Jazz is a musical form that was developed by Afro-Americans, by black people. And it is a uniquely American form of music. And jazz was an immensely large part of American cultural diplomacy when it came to our international broadcasting, for example, over the Voice of America. And we had a jazz program that was one of the most popular programs all around the world. And this is effectively, yes, there were white people, who were learning to play and did play jazz excellently, but we know where it all came from. It came from a minority community in the United States. Now, that's just one example, but there are other examples like this. I remember how during the Cold War, the Soviets, as have all of our adversaries, tried to exacerbate race relations in the United States, to increase hostility between blacks and whites, particularly. And the Soviets, the Japanese tried to do this during World War II. The Soviets did it throughout their whole history. And the Chinese are doing it now. The Chinese have at least 600 communist front organizations operating in the United States alone. And some of them are supporting the so-called Black Lives Matter movement, which was responsible for many of the riots in 2020. And so one of the things that we did during the Cold War is that on Tchaikovsky Street in Moscow, where was located the US Embassy, we put up a billboard with cultural information about America. And this is so that the people walking on the sidewalk could read this. And there were very few information sources about America that were reliable that they could read, because everything they saw about America was through the lens of Soviet propaganda. And so people were watching reading our billboard. But then the Soviets decided they did not like this. And so they couldn't take down the billboard because it was on embassy property. So they built a lawn. They planted grass on the sidewalk in front of the billboard. And it is illegal, it was illegal in the Soviet Union to step on a lawn, to step on the grass. And so people had to stand 15 feet away from the billboard, and they couldn't read it anymore. Well, we then increased the print size on that billboard, and the time I was visiting, there was a whole story about the struggle of the Reverend Martin Luther King for civil rights in the United States, and how he was giving a speech from the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. His famous "I Have a Dream" speech, where he was dreaming about a society that would judge people not according to the color of their skin, but according to the content of their character. And here, people saw these pictures, even if they, and even with the larger print, they could see, yes, there was a problem that black people were facing in discrimination in America, but America was free enough for him to be able to give a speech in the nation's capital to a vast crowd of people. And of course, here we are. We were, in spite of a legacy of discrimination in the United States, we were working on improving ourselves, and we're telling the story about a minority group and its struggle for the inalienable rights that are actually guaranteed them by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so this is a challenge, and an effort must be made by the cultural, and diplomacy authorities to be inclusive, and of course that helps in building internal harmony within your own country, especially if there are interethnic and interracial and interreligious differences within your country.
Test. Okay. Hello, thank you for your presentation. My name is Lumina. I'm the expert staff from Diplomacy, Promotion and Cooperation. I actually have two questions from my colleague here as the expert staff for our minister. The first question is, you've mentioned that cultural diplomacy is effective because of its people-to-people contact and independence from the state power. So how do we, as the government of Indonesia, strategize on making policies that have the balance between not disturbing the independence of cultural actors, but also pursuing our national interests in certain countries and regions. So that's the first question. How can we find the right balance between independence and also national interests? The second one is, how can cultural diplomacy help us to foresighting new emerging issues, such as AI advancement, brain rot for our youths, and social media, and also many other unpredictable contemporary issues for conflicts and wars in the regions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
As for your first question, oh, we're going to take one more question? Okay.
Yeah, I may be the last, Pak John. So my name is Sally. I recently worked at the Directorate for Cultural Diplomacy, Promotion and Cooperation. So I have some questions here. The topic you have presented is particularly compelling for us, especially in exploring how cultural diplomacy can be applied within context of conflict and confrontation that you mentioned. And Indonesia, with its cultural heritage, has long demonstrated that influence can be nurtured through shared tradition and mutual respect rather than confrontation that we all witnessed all these years long. Yet in today's global politics, cultural diplomacy can also operate in the gray zone that you mentioned earlier, shaping narrative and alliances without triggering open conflict. And you mentioned that in the gray zone, for example, and later that you mentioned about how American with the jazz diplomacy through the Soviet, and it is adopted by the Korean with its Hallyu or Korean wave. They have so many stages with the Korean wave of that Hallyu. In this context, when cultural or religious networks are engaged in such strategies, to what extent can their involvement be considered legitimate rather than manipulative? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you, Pak John, for the chance.
These are all very good questions. With regard to your question, the first one of the juxtaposition of traditional diplomatic requirements with the desirability of conducting good cultural diplomacy, this really has to be a two-track foreign policy. And it isn't just concerning cultural diplomacy, it concerns public diplomacy in general. I will give you an example, and this is the problem of the bias in foreign ministries. We have the Voice of America. During the Cold War, a Voice of America broadcast to one of the communist satellites of the Soviet Union, like Bulgaria, will raise some serious human rights issues about the activities in that country. Well, the foreign minister, the communist foreign minister of Bulgaria, will call the American ambassador and will start yelling at him for Voice of America broadcasts that are offensive to the Bulgarian government. Now, what often happens is that the U.S. ambassador starts apologizing, and he says, "Oh, we're so sorry, Mr. Minister, that we have offended you, and we realize that broadcasts of this type are, aggravating relations between our two countries." And so he goes back to the embassy and he sends a cable to Washington, D.C., saying, "Please get those people at the Voice of America to tone down their rhetoric, to, stop broadcasting offensive programs like this." Now, this is a classic example of where the bias in favor of relations with governments surpasses the requirements of good public diplomacy, including cultural diplomacy. And if the Voice of America is censored for telling the truth about human rights violations, this is terrible for public diplomacy because we are abandoning the people. We're not bearing witness to their human rights violations. We are not expressing sympathy with them for their suffering. When other people suffer, please let us express sympathy for them, for goodness sake. That's how and if you don't, if you leave them, then that audience is demoralized. Now, totalitarian regimes want to keep people demoralized. The whole objective of a totalitarian regime is to get people to live with a fatalistic attitude that they are simply going to accept their lot in the world, that nothing can ever change. You can never change the tyrannical regime. And so, and people live in fear because you don't know who is an informant to the secret police. And in China, there are millions and millions and millions of informants to the secret police. In communist East Germany, there were 25% of the entire population were informants to the secret police. So people you knew were informants, but you didn't know who they were. And so you live in an atmosphere of complete fear and mistrust. And when people do not trust each other, they become atomized. And atomization means separating every individual from everybody else. What happens when you spray? You spray something, spray bottle, and the liquid becomes thousands of tiny little droplets that are separated from each other, and there is no longer a single liquid. And when people are atomized, they are all alone against the all-powerful Communist Party state. And that's where the party wants to keep them. That's where the party wants them, in a state of fear, mistrust, atomization, and the psychological state of futile resignation, where they're resigned to their fate. They feel resistance to the regime, and attempts to change it are futile. That's how totalitarian systems work. That's how they work. Do you want to live under that kind of a system? I don't. My father's family lost everything to communism twice. My mother spent 2.5 years in a Soviet prison. Why was she arrested and put in the Soviet prison? Because she had a college education, and her father was a businessman. So she was a class enemy. And the Soviet regime had to remove those kinds of people. I don't want to live under that, and I don't think you do either. So people living under communism need hope. And if we stand with them, simply giving moral support to them, they will not feel abandoned. They'll feel that there is hope. And that's a separate policy than dealing with the government. Now, the British were better at this than we were. If the BBC gave an offensive broadcast on human rights to the Bulgarians, the British ambassador would be called in. He would be criticized and yelled at by the foreign minister. And then the British ambassador would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Minister. Our broadcasts, yes, I understand how they are harming our relations. But you know, you must understand the BBC is an independent institution and I can't do anything about it." So he walks away and the British can have their cake and eat it too. They can bear moral witness to the suffering of the Bulgarian people while maintaining correct relations with the Bulgarian government. Public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy have to go on all the time, to stand with the people. Now, I can't remember your second question. Oh, on yeah, there are new issues, AI and social media and so on. I don't know that cultural diplomats can answer those questions. I think that these are internal problems of the society to develop. There are internal problems of trying to work out a proper ethics for artificial intelligence, proper controls so that it doesn't take over the world. I used to come up to our photocopying machine in our office, and I used to think that it was trying to control my life. And, you know, that maybe the photocopying machines would take over the world. So society will figure that out, and the cultural diplomats can navigate accordingly. That's the best I can say. Now, remind me. Okay. This is a very interesting question about whether, tell me if I have it correct, avoiding the co-optation or even the corruption of manipulation of independent cultural actors by a government. And religious actors too, yeah.
That's okay. So all the component of cultures could be like it's the tools for cultural diplomacy as the tools, or we can say it's a way for a gray zone that you mentioned earlier about how it can affect for a conflict or confrontation. For sometimes it views as like more than less legitimate ways, because sometimes it's just viewed as not legitimate. But sometimes we can say that maybe cultural diplomacy can meet the legitimate way into the moral standing that you mentioned on your presentation, the moral standing, the international relations, and also meets the international law, maybe the three parts of the cultural diplomacy that can be applied into the gray zone for the conflict or confrontation.
Okay, can you give me some?
Can cultural diplomacy be a useful tool in conflict and struggles with other countries that are?
And of course, in a non-aggressive way for the confrontation.
Non-aggressive, but still
yes.
effective instruments
yes.
in conflicts in the
With regard to the question of the manipulation or co-optation of independent non-governmental actors who may be brought into the activities of official cultural diplomacy, I think that there may be a risk here if those independent actors are political opportunists who simply want to ingratiate themselves with the government. You know, there are lots of people who gravitate towards political power. And even in, I have seen in Washington, in my 53 years in Washington, I have seen, you know, some administrations that have, let me say, greater purity of motive, who have more integrity, who are there to, you know, there are some people who simply want power and control. And then there are some people who want to achieve a worthy mission. And as a matter of fact, everybody working, you know, in the public sphere can be divided into two different categories. There are careerists who only care about their careers. They want the job, the promotion, the credit, the glory. They want the power. They want the bureaucratic empire. They want the prestigious office. And they are ready to risk compromising their honor to get those things. And then there are mission-oriented people who put the mission higher than themselves. And this is what we teach our students, by the way. And we say, which one are you going to be? The mission-oriented person has a spirit of service. Service to your family, to your neighbor, to your community, to your customer, to your organization, and to your country. And maybe service to a higher good, to your God. And so, you know, organizations, you know, every organization that has a coherent mission to accomplish wants mission-oriented people working for it. But when people come to the corridors of power, oh, they get very hungry and thirsty for power. And even in, you know, there's some people who run for president, and I would say that Ronald Reagan, who was my boss in the 1980s, he wanted to accomplish a mission. He didn't care about the prestige of being president of the United States and a glorious hero. But there are other presidents who wanted to become president because that would be the next award that they would get in their life, and the next toy that they would have on their path to their secular heaven. And so I think it is, you know, I don't think that the government may try to manipulate people, but if people have their integrity, if people are mission-oriented, and they're committed to doing their cultural diplomacy without compromising their principles, then that's not going to be a problem. It really isn't. Maybe they won't get the contract. Maybe some cultural organization that is willing to sell its soul for political favor will get the contract from the cultural ministry, okay? But, okay, then the corrupt people who will sell their souls will get the contract, and that's too bad. But the people who are honest, the people who have honor, the people who have integrity, the people who are service-oriented will still retain that, and they will get many of the things that the careerists and the opportunists want, maybe not as fast, but they'll get them eventually because they'll be respected. They'll be respected. So this is a matter, you know, the government, we need honorable people in the government who are not going to force people to sell their souls. But this is a question of building an honorable civil service, an honorable foreign service, an honorable intelligence service, etc. You need honorable people in these positions. And many of these are life and death kinds of jobs. I mean, the businesses we're in at IWP are life and death businesses, where the errors that can be made in our businesses are the costliest errors that can be made in the public life of the nation, in terms of costly, in terms of blood and treasure. And so we need honorable people, and we need moral leaders who are ready to set an example by how they behave. Moral leadership is not simply for the people at the top. It's for people in the middle. It's for people in the bottom who demonstrate that they are not going to sell their souls to get ahead. And, you know, they're not going to sell their soul to Satan, okay? That's what it really comes down to. So the last part of the question was, remind me, Tim. It was, did I answer your question well enough, or do I still have something else?
Maybe the last part is how, in your opinion, how cultural diplomacy will not view as a manipulative way in the gray zone with, between the peace area and the cold area that you mentioned earlier. How cultural diplomacy will not view as manipulative way into the conflict or confrontation.
Okay, did you?
Cultural diplomacy will not be viewed as manipulative and function effectively in the gray zone between peace,
Right.
relations, and Cold War opportunities.
There is always a risk that any kind of governmental activity in the realm of public diplomacy, and that includes cultural diplomacy, will be seen as propaganda. It can be taken badly by others. There is that risk. But one thing about cultural diplomacy is that we're not asking for a quid pro quo. We're not asking for something back. The United States has an organization called the Peace Corps, where we have usually younger volunteers who go to usually, you know, poorer countries and try to help poor people improve their farming techniques, for example. And they're simply there to help, and we're not asking anything back, except maybe give us a chance, you know, give us a chance to have a better reputation in your mind. We do medical diplomacy. We send our hospital ships in the Navy for a tour to 25 countries around South America and the Caribbean, and we help cure diseases and do surgeries for people who cannot get them cured in their own country. And is this propaganda? Well, we're trying to build goodwill. We're trying to build goodwill. And, you know, it's, you know, people will always see their adversaries and cynics will always see the possibility of this type of manipulation. But I think that one has to persist and try to do these things. And if you do them honorably, if you do your cultural diplomacy honorably, you can start developing relationships of trust. You know, you can start developing relationships of trust. When people do business in natural international commerce, a trading relationship between an American and an Indonesian, if these are harmonious business relationships, then a relationship of trust can be developed. And I call that relationship an offensive, preemptive, counter-propaganda operation. Offensive, preemptive, counter-propaganda operation. So that when hostile propaganda about the American appears on the Indonesian's desk, and he reads it, and he's going to say, well, I know Pak Tim, and Pak Tim is a nice guy, and he's honest, and I've done business with him for 10 years, and he's never cheated me, and he's always delivered on his promises. Not all the Americans are like what the propagandists are saying what they are. And thanks to Pak Tim and the fact that he's an honorable guy. So, you know, you just have to keep doing it. And if you try to do it with integrity, you do it with a moral foundation, and especially given what Indonesia is. I mean, Indonesia is an amazing country that has an incredible potential to bring greater peace to the world precisely because it has it has organizations like the Nahdlatul Ulama that are making a strategic difference in the world, a strategic difference. And you know, it is taken the lead in the promotion of the so-called R20, the religious outreach of the G20. The G20 are the top 20 economies. And for the G20 to have something called the R20, and for the R20 to be led by organizations that have been developed by the Indonesian Nahdlatul Ulama, this is amazing. This is strategic. And it is an incredible salvo in the larger war against the larger war that the totalitarians in their different varieties are conducting against us. And I'll only say also, Indonesia has tended to be non-aligned. Well, you may think you're non-aligned, but you're not. You're in the community of democracies. And communist China does not like democracy. The central fact of political life in China is China's fear of its own people, because it's an illegitimate government, because it rules without the consent of their own people. And so they are afraid of democratic ideas. And every time that Taiwan has an election, Beijing goes crazy. They start launching missiles over the Taiwan Straits. They don't like Taiwanese democracy because the Taiwanese prove that the Chinese people are capable of living under democracy. They don't like Indonesian democracy either. And the day may come when you will become under even greater assault in the non-kinetic instruments of power, the non-kinetic instruments of conflict that are being waged against us in America and against you in Indonesia. And if you're not aware of them all, then you need to demand that your authorities should give you some good reports about what is happening. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience, for listening to me. God bless you and God bless your country. And one other thing, I want to congratulate you on the 80th anniversary of your national independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak John. Can we have another round of applause for all of us? I will, thank you. I will not do the wrap-ups because there are a lot of takeaways, but it has been an interesting dialogue. So I would like to thank you all for your attendance, patience, and your active participation. And once again, thank you, Pak John Lenskowski, for your insights, and Timothy. It's a pleasure to have you all. And with that, I want to close this dialogue and wish you all have a pleasant remaining day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kepada Ibu Direktur Jenderal Kebudayaan, Diplomasi, Promosi dan Kerjasama Kebudayaan, Ibu Endah T.D. Ratnasuti. Berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan semuanya. Terima kasih juga atas partisipasi dan kehadiran teman-teman dan Bapak Ibu semua pada pagi hingga siang hari ini bersabar bersama kami. Sampai jumpa di lain kesempatan. Silakan menikmati hidangan yang telah disediakan. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.